Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like, and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I'm going to be doing another episode of quick album reviews, or quick music reviews, depending on which one you would prefer to call it. But if you have seen this series before on my channel, then you know the rundown, but if you haven't, allow me to explain what it is. Essentially, quick music reviews is where I give a rundown on many different albums that I have heard in the past weeks or even months, because I just don't have a time to dedicate to review to everything. And I basically give my shortened thoughts on them, although if I do have more to say about an album, I will allow myself the time to say so. But we do have another episode of that today, and I have 6 different albums on the docket to discuss from past months of July, and even some as recent as August, and some as long ago as June in some cases. So let's go ahead and get started with the first album that I will be discussing. So first on the list is Post Malone with his newest album, Austin, which is of course named after himself. So you could almost call this a self-titled album, not technically, but Austin is his first name, so it is sort of that in a sense. And with that, you can sort of get the sense that in this new album, Post Malone is basically sort of trying to do something that is a little more personal and a little more true to himself compared to his previous albums. The singles for this album did have me hopeful that we were going to get a more interesting sound from him. I really enjoy Chemical as a lead single. I think it is one of my maybe potentially favorite Post Malone songs I've heard. I really liked the change that it had in it sound-wise for him, much more of a pop rock dedicated sound. Morning was also a pretty fun track. Even though it was short, it stayed pretty memorable in its short runtime. But how does the rest of the album fare? Well, I would definitely say that this release is a bit of a step up from his last one, which was so dour and all over the place and just felt like record label interference more than anything. It didn't feel like he wanted to make this album, and you just get the feeling that there wasn't much passion behind it, and it didn't even do that well on the Hot 100. Whereas with this one, you can feel he is much more in his lane and much more comfortable with what he is making. Although there are still some complications I have with this album, but there are some definite positives. First of all, Something Real is an excellent cut. I really like the bombastic nature of the song with the choir behind him, and Post Malone asking if he can attach onto something real, if he can have a sense of knowing who he is as an artist, or if that is impossible. And I like the sort of contradictions the song has with him talking about his materialistic wealth, but then going on to say that that stuff shouldn't matter to him, but it still sort of does in some ways. A lot of this album is pretty stripped back in terms of all the musical styles that Post Malone is doing. In fact, this one stays pretty firmly in the pop lane with some slight rock tendencies incorporated. Unfortunately, there's nothing quite as forward-pushing or very fun and catchy as Chemical, in my opinion, on this album, but there are still some moments that I think really work. Nova Candy, for an example, is just pure pop bliss to the extreme, and I really do like it. I think Post Malone's vocals work super well on this cut. The closer, Laugh It Off, is actually a pretty solid way to end off this album and gives you a somber feeling with it. I also think, for honestly as silly as Texas Tea can be, I do think it is a pretty fun song, and I think it works in what it sets out to do, even though it may not necessarily be the best written song out there. And Overdrive, even though it is overselling it a little bit in my opinion, I do still find the song to be pretty solid in what it's setting forward to do, and I think it works generally well in its purpose. Unfortunately, there are parts of this album that make it a very mixed bag. First of all, this album is way too long at 17 tracks and 51 minutes. I think there was a lot of fat on here that could have been trimmed off and made this album a much more just succinct experience than it ultimately was. And there are definitely places, especially in the second half, where you can feel it wearing down on you. There's also some songs that just are not very good here. Socialite has some truly awful lyrical moments that I just cannot stand. And many people have already complained about the Shrek line in it. If you know what I'm talking about, then yeah, you've seen those complaints before, and they are warranted because it is a badly written lyric. I also do sort of like how he tries to recapture the rawness of the opening track with Don't Understand, but it is a bit of a dour way to begin the album, and he did that on the last album too, and I had some complicated thoughts on it there too. While I did like Reputation on the last album and thought it was a very raw song, this one does not capture that rawness in the same way, in my opinion. Overall, though, I do still think this album is a step up from the last one. I do think it has a much more consistent sound to it, which I appreciate, and I think this might be where Post Malone has sounded the most confident in his artistry, even though I do like Hollywood's Bleeding a lot more for just embracing the rock and pop tendencies in a much more risk-taking way. This one still does a decent job at it. I just wish that more of the uninteresting songs had been cut off and that the album flowed a little better and maybe had some more big interesting moments in it that I felt were sort of lacking. I'm going to give this album a solid 3 out of 5 stars. If you like Post Malone, you're probably going to like this album. Next up is the newest album by the Maine, which happens to be their self-titled album, and it ended up coming out at the beginning of August. In fact, it came out on August 1st, which is a sort of fun release date, just releasing something at the beginning of the month in a sort of unassuming way. Now, I'll be honest, the past 2 Maine albums have not been my favorites by any means. They're one from last year, for an example, which was entitled XOXO From Love and Anxiety in Real Time. I thought that one was probably their weakest in quite some time, if not their weakest album, period. I just didn't care for it, and if anything, it has gone down in favor with me. And You Are Okay, while I do like that album a little better, I'll admit I haven't returned to that one much, and it just didn't hold up to the best of their albums like Lovely Little Lonely or American Candy. But with this self-titled, they have given those 2 albums a run for their money, in my opinion. They have released something here which is really good, and I think deserves the name of being their self-titled. It's just a really solid album front to back, and I would say is even great. It has some just excellent moments from the Maine that I really like, and it sees them embracing the pop rock sound that they've boasted to the fullest extent possible, while taking some creative liberties with it that, in my opinion, work very well. How to Exit a Room, which was one of the singles, is probably one of my favorite Maine songs ever. I just love what this one does. It, subject-wise, is so interesting, talking about how to leave a relationship, but also seeing the lead singer just sort of being vulnerable and saying that he is a professional at that at this point. And the song as a whole is just really dynamic for the Maine. I really like how it begins more like what you would expect out of a classic The Maine song, but then it has this sort of epic swell at the end that I think works very well for The Maine. This is an iconic song for them, and it's definitely going to be one of my favorite songs of the year. Blame was the lead single, and I think fittingly so. This very much so fits comfortably into their wheelhouse, and I really like it. I especially love the verses where the lead singer is just singing off things in very fast succession. The Mood I'm In, Just So You Know, is also a wonderful song. I really liked this one, and how it sort of has a ballad-like feel in the verses, but then absolutely explodes in the chorus, and it creates this really heart-wrenching feeling where the lead singer is just sort of highlighting his feelings about things, and he's just sort of saying it in a very simplistic and matter-of-fact way that I think really works for the song. It's not subtle lyrically at all, but I don't think it really was trying to be. Funny How is just a very sweet moment in the album where John is singing about the birth of his daughter and talking about how it's sort of funny how she came at just the right time for him. And it's just a really nice song to hear, and just backed by a simple acoustic guitar, I think it creates a really personable moment. The closing song, Spiraling, is maybe one of my favorite Maine closers out there. I just really like what this song does, and it just ends the album off on a very powerful note that I think will be hard to forget. And to be honest, there aren't that many weak moments on this album. I really liked it from front to back. Cars and Caution Signs may have overstayed its welcome at over 5 minutes long, and I don't think it's the most interesting song out there, but at the same time, it's not something that I'm going to say is entirely awful. I also think that maybe Thoughts I Have While Lying in Bed is a little cliched, but still makes up for it by being pretty fun. But overall, I just don't have that many complaints about this album at all. I think it's a really great release from them, and it's nice to see them sort of back in form after 2 albums from them that I feel are maybe a little underwhelming in comparison to their other releases. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for this one. It's nice to have the Maine back, and I'm going to see myself returning to this album a lot more times this year. That I am sure of. Next up is an album from quite possibly my favorite pop artist of all time, and that is Rae Jepsen. She is sort of the artist who started doing the 80s nostalgia earlier than everyone else, and unfortunately, she's never gotten the huge amount of credit that other big artists have gotten for doing 80s pop, but she deserves a lot more recognition for it, for doing it perhaps better than anyone else does. The Loveliest Time serves as the sort of B-sides to The Loneliest Time, which is something that Carly always does with her new album rollouts. She always has the initial album itself, and then a year later she will release the B-sides. And it's a common sort of agreement amongst her fans that her B-sides almost always tend to be better than the actual album. And this is another album where I'm going to have to say that that is the case. I did really like The Loneliest Time a lot, but I did think it had some mixed moments that didn't work super well, but also some really high highs. But The Loveliest Time is an album full of consistent highs over and over and over again, and this one is right up there with Emotion for me in terms of my favorite Rae Jepsen albums. This release is just excellent, with not many weak points to complain about. It talks thematically a lot about moonlight and sort of the feeling of loneliness that she is in at the beginning part of the album, but then the moonlight sort of goes away and there's lots more emphasis on sunlight and happiness in the second half of the album, showing that she has found a love that is really making her feel a totally different way, and it's an arc that works very well for this album. Shy Boy was a lead single on this album, and man, if this isn't Rae Jepsen at the top of her craft. I love this cut, and her just addressing this person that is very introverted, but someone that she is very attracted to, and it is such a fun track. It is an 80s bop to the extreme, and it is so much fun to listen to. When I ask for 80s nostalgia, this is exactly the type of track that I am looking for. Collage is one of Rae Jepsen's most drawn back songs, and one of her most beautiful sounding ballads in my opinion. I just love the synth work in the background of this, and Carly's voice is just so raw in this. I really would love to see more songs from her like this one because it works for her very powerfully. And it's a super interesting cut in terms of relationship subject matter because she's talking about how the fact that she doesn't love herself is actually hurting other people in her life as well. And personally, it's probably my favorite on the album too, right along with Psychedelic Switch, which is sort of the stark opposite of Collage, where she is seeing this possibility of a new relationship and something just switches in her and she is suddenly seeing everything in color again. Put It to Rest is also great and just sort of feels like a classic Rae Jepsen song in my opinion. And Stadium Love sees her going for this bigger rock chorus feel that I really liked. It does feel like a bigger than life stadium type of song, and it works very well for that purpose. There just aren't that many negatives to this album at all. I really enjoyed it from front to back. I'd say, sadly, the opening cut did give me a negative impression of this album at first because I found this one to be a little bit uninteresting. And sadly, the closing to Weak in Love just didn't super impress me. But overall, I did like this album a lot. I think it is one of Carly's most consistent to date and just shows her at the top of her game once again. And it definitely shows why Rae Jepsen is one of the best pop artists to do it. Very strong 4 out of 5 stars for me. This is one of my favorite albums of the year so far. Next up, I want to talk about Kim Petras' newest album, Feed the Beast. Now, I'll admit this is not one where I'm left with much to say, but I did find myself being surprised that I had more positive feelings than negative ones on this album, especially considering that I wasn't the hugest fan of the lead single Alone. Nicki Minaj's verse was especially underwhelming, which is pretty typical of her at this point, but also it sounded like the song was trying to feed off this mid-2000s pop nostalgia. Thankfully, that song wasn't reflective of the album as a whole, which has a lot more fun moments in it. I will say that this album has a fairly predictable structure to it, but that is what you can expect out of a mainstream pop album like this, so it's not like I'm gonna complain, especially when it is pretty slickly produced. Kim's vocals on it tend to be pretty solid, and there are some pretty catchy choruses to boot as well. King of Hearts is a great example of this early in the album. Definitely has some Eurobeat influences to it, I would say, and I think it really goes off in the chorus and creates something where it's sort of irresistible to sing along, in my opinion. Also, Claws is probably my favorite on the album. This one would definitely go off in a nightclub setting. It just has that very energetic feeling to it. And I sort of like the production in it, especially in the chorus, where it's saying in your head in the background over and over. Minute is also a pretty good song and definitely does a lot better of a job of bringing back the sort of 2000s pop nostalgia, in my opinion. And there are some other positive songs that I liked here as well, including the title track and Thousand Pieces, and even Bait with Banks to an extent works pretty well. There are definitely points in this album where I just felt uninvested and sort of checked out. And there are some songs on here that I do think are truly bad. Alone is one of them, of course, but there are some that are actually worse than it. Hit It From the Back, which does have some intentionally silly and overly sexual lyrics, just doesn't vibe with me at all. And Sex Talk is so repetitive that it bores me to tears, and is definitely one of my least favorite songs of the year. Just the lack of originality and creativity in it really just didn't work for me at all, and I just found it to be very tedious and tiresome. I was surprised after hearing this album that I had more positive than negative to say about it. In fact, in some ways, it reminded me of Ava Max's album earlier from this year, although I definitely like Ava Max's album a lot better and think it works much better as a solid pop album. This one does have some surprising comparisons to that, and I think it's a good thing that I can sort of say that it's not that much worse than that album, and that there are some really good moments on this that make it worth returning back to. It is overall a decent album, though, and not something that I would give like a glowing recommendation, but there are some really strong moments from this that I would check out. 3 out of 5 stars for me. This was a sort of pleasant surprise. Next up is Truth Killer by Sevendust, who is very much so a well-known alternative metal band. They have been sort of having a resurgence and have returned to the scene since 2018 after taking a bit of a break in 2015. But I will be honest, Sevendust, while I do definitely see their talent, I am not going to deny that. I've never been able to get into them. Everything about them is very competent, but I've never found them to be a particularly mind-blowing metal band to me, if I'm being honest. And Truth Killer just sort of solidifies that for me, if I'm being honest. Now, this is not a bad album at all. In fact, the past 2 Sevendust albums I've also liked, but have not found to be overly impressive, and I feel similarly about this one, although I might like this one even a little bit less than their past 2 albums, sadly. There are some good moments on this album, and I like that it tries to change it up by adding in some sort of synth work into the mix. I think it is sort of a nice change that makes this one feel a little fresh. The album even begins off quite well with its opening 3 songs. I Might Let the Devil Win is a much more subtle opening for a Sevendust album, and it's much more of a ballad that is sort of slow burn and builds up, but I like the build-up of the song, and it grabs your attention for sure before that very fitting explosion. The title track is really good and has some sort of new metal influences to it, in my opinion, and I really like what it does subject-wise for the album, and I think LeJohn's vocals in this one are particularly confident. Won't Stop the Bleeding might be my favorite on the album. I just love the guitar work on this one. It feels very furious and fast-paced, and it's just one that is easy to have a lot of fun to. I also like songs like the closing track, Fence, which was one of the singles of the album. No Revolution is also a pretty solid cut and might be one of LeJohn's best vocal performances on the album. But sadly, overall, I just don't have much to say about this album like Kim Petras's. It just doesn't leave much memorability behind for me. Like I said, it's not a bad album, but there aren't that many choruses that I see myself coming back to. There aren't that many big moments that I see myself being super impressed by. Certain songs are just sort of come and go, like Holy Water and Leave Hell Behind, and even Superficial Drug, which runs on a little too long in my opinion. And that's sort of the case for this album as a whole. I do think it is a little bit too long, and especially in the second half, it starts to really peter off and just not leave me with much to say. It's a fine album. It's not bad. I'm not going to say it's terrible at all. I like it. I think it's decent, but it's not great, and it's just not one that I see myself coming back to a whole lot. Decent 3 out of 5 stars, but I think you could find better in the world of alternative metal, if I'm being honest. Finally, I'm going to end off with Pink Tape by Lil Uzi Vert. I'll admit, the main reason I checked this out is that I've never checked out Lil Uzi Vert before, and I'm always trying to expand my taste in music. Even though I know an album like this probably isn't going to appeal to me, I always try to give albums like this a chance and just see if they work out for me or not. And unfortunately, this one doesn't, although I do see lots of threads of potential in here. It's clear that Lil Uzi Vert is someone who is really interested in pursuing a variety of genres, and I think that they are very ambitious in that regard and create an album that can feel pretty unique in places, especially for the genre that they are associated with. But I just don't find myself being super intrigued by most of the stuff on here, and I'll admit the lyrical content especially is a turnoff in a lot of places for me, especially when Lil Uzi Vert is essentially trying to justify themselves in certain parts where it feels more unneeded than anything else, if I'm being honest. There are some good songs on here. For an example, Werewolf works pretty well, although I will admit that this is more Bring Me the Horizon songs than Lil Uzi Vert, but it was sort of cool to see them sort of collaborating with Bring Me. But I think this one works pretty well, along with the song Nakamura, which sort of feels like a wrestling anthem, and I think intentionally so. This one feels really bigger than life, and probably where Uzi Vert feels the most confident as a vocalist. I also think that The End with Baby Metal works pretty well, although Baby Metal feels sort of like an addition that was last minute more than anything else, and they sort of feel disconnected from Lil Uzi Vert's song. But, I mean, as a whole, this album just feels like a very mixed bag. It feels like Lil Uzi Vert is trying to do a little bit of everything, and so it comes across as very just messy in many ways. Like the sort of pitched down effects on Fire Alarm are just incredibly annoying. Endless Fashion is easily one of my least favorite songs of the year. I really do not like the reinterpolation of I'm Blue on here. We already saw last year that that was a frustrating thing to do on a song by David Guetta with Baby Rexha, and it might fare even worse here in some ways. I don't know why the interpolation was necessary. It adds nothing to the song. And Nicki Minaj's verse in this, I mean, just straight up embarrassing. The MAGA verse that she says just made me absolutely cringe. CS is almost so bad it's good in trying to be a cover of Chop Suey. It is so badly produced, and the guitar work just sounds really bad, and Lil Uzi Vert just doesn't sound super great vocally here. It sounds like they're in the background of their own song. I could see this one going off in a live setting for sure, and to be fair, it is really hard to cover a System of a Down song effectively like this one, but this song still just does not come across well and is definitely a huge low point and deserves a lot of the critical backlash it's gotten. But overall, this album doesn't offend me by any means. It's just not an album that is really for me. I just don't see myself returning to it. Even the songs that I liked on here, I haven't really returned to them much, and it's just sort of an album that left me with not much to say outside of some pretty decent couple of songs and then some really bad moments that just left me with a bad taste in my mouth. 2.5 out of 5 stars for this one. So yeah, that was this episode of Quick Music Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the albums I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I'd appreciate it if you once again left a like on my video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.